In the shadowed halls of Tudor England, where ambition danced with treachery, one woman's name echoed through time: Anne Boleyn. Hers was a tale woven from threads of passion, power, and peril, a saga that shook the foundations of a kingdom and reshaped its destiny. Born to a world of velvet and steel, Anne rose from the courts of Europe to ensnare the heart of a king, Henry VIII, whose obsession would ignite a revolution. With her sharp wit, beguiling charm, and unyielding resolve, she was no mere consort, but a force that bent history to her will. Yet the crown she claimed was a perilous throne. In a court of whispers and daggers, where loyalty was fleeting and enemies lurked in every shadow, Anne's ascent drew envy and dread. Her love, once a flame that defied a kingdom's laws, became a spark that lit her doom. Accused of betrayal, branded a traitor, she faced the cold steel of the executioner's blade, her fate sealed by the very man who swore to cherish her. From the dizzying heights of queenship to the grim scaffold of the Tower, Anne's journey was a tempest of triumph and tragedy. This is no mere chronicle of a queen. It is an epic of a woman who dared to dream beyond her station, who wielded her mind as a weapon, and whose legacy endures in the reign of her daughter, Elizabeth I. Step into the storm of Anne Boleyn's life, a tale of love, betrayal, and a fall that shook the world.
Chapter 1. The Dawn of Ambition. In the twilight of the early 16th century, where the mists of England clung to ancient forests and the spires of castles pierced the heavens, a star was born, not in the celestial vault, but in the heart of a noble house. Anne Boleyn, daughter of Thomas Boleyn, entered a world where bloodlines were chains and ambition a perilous flame. Hers was no ordinary birth, for destiny had already begun to weave its intricate tapestry around her, threading her fate through the courts of Europe and into the very soul of a kingdom on the cusp of upheaval. The Boleyn family, though not of royal lineage, bore the weight of ambition as if it were their birthright. Thomas Boleyn, a man of sharp intellect and sharper ambition, was a diplomat whose footsteps echoed in the grand halls of foreign courts. His wife, Elizabeth, carried the grace of the Howard lineage, one of England's most storied families. Together, they nurtured their children in the crucible of opportunity, and none burned brighter than Anne. Born around 1501 in the rolling fields of Kent at Hever Castle, Anne was a child of promise, her dark eyes alight with a spark that seemed to defy the constraints of her time. From her earliest days, Anne was no mere shadow in the tapestry of her family's aspirations. She was a flame, fierce and unyielding, her mind as sharp as the quills that scribes used to pen the chronicles of kings. Her father, ever the strategist, saw in her not just a daughter, but a key to unlock the gates of power. In an era when women were often pawns in the great game of dynasties, Anne was destined to be a player. Her education, a rare privilege for a woman, was her first weapon. Sent across the seas to the Netherlands at the tender age of 12, she served in the court of Margaret of Austria, a regent whose wisdom and authority were a beacon in a world ruled by men. Here Anne learned the art of courtly grace, how to dance with words, to charm with a glance, and to navigate the treacherous currents of politics. The Low Countries were but a prelude. In 1514, Anne's journey took her to the glittering court of France, where she served as a maid of honor to Queen Claude. The French court was a crucible of culture, a kaleidoscope of art, music, and intrigue. Anne drank deeply from its wells. She mastered the French tongue, absorbed the elegance of its fashions, and honed her wit in the company of poets and princes. Her dark hair, swept back to reveal a face both delicate and commanding, became a canvas for her allure. She learned to wield her charm like a blade, subtle yet precise. And her laughter rang through the halls of Fontainebleau like a melody that lingered long after she departed. France shaped her not into mere a lady, but into a vision of sophistication that would one day captivate a king. By 1522, Anne returned to England, a woman transformed. No longer the girl who had left Hever's quiet halls, she was a force of nature, cloaked in the elegance of the continent and armed with a mind that could rival any scholar. The English court, under the reign of Henry VIII, was a stage of splendor and danger, where ambition was both currency and curse. Henry, a king in his prime, was a colossus of charisma and volatility. His court buzzed with noblemen vying for favor, their wives and daughters draped in silks that hid their own schemes. Into this cauldron stepped Anne, summoned to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's steadfast but aging wife. Catherine, devout and regal, was the daughter of Spanish monarchs, a queen whose virtue was matched only by her inability to produce a male heir. The court whispered of Henry's growing discontent, of his restless heart and his hunger for a son to secure the Tudor line. It was a fracture in the kingdom's foundation, a crack through which Anne would slip, her presence a spark in a tinderbox. She was not the most beautiful woman at court. Her features were sharp rather than soft, her complexion olive rather than fair, but beauty was not her weapon. It was her vitality, her wit, her refusal to fade into the background that turned heads and stilled tongues. She danced with the grace of a deer, sang with the clarity of a lark, and spoke with a boldness that bordered on defiance. To see Anne Boleyn was to see a woman who demanded to be remembered.
Her arrival did not go unnoticed. Men of the court, from poets to knights, were drawn to her like moths to a flame. Among them was Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland, whose heart fell swiftly to Anne's charm. Their courtship, though fleeting, was a blaze of youthful passion, a promise of love that dared to defy the rigid hierarchies of the court. But Thomas Wolsey, the king's powerful cardinal, saw danger in their union. Percy was betrothed to another, and Anne, though noble, was no match for a future earl in Wolsey's eyes. The cardinal's intervention was swift and brutal, tearing the lovers apart and planting a seed of enmity in Anne's heart. She would not forget Wolsey's slight, nor would she forgive. Yet it was not Percy who would define Anne's destiny, but the king himself. Henry VIII, a man of boundless appetite for glory, for power, for love, first beheld Anne in the spring of 1526 during a masque at Greenwich Palace. The court was ablaze with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of roses and ambition. Anne, dressed in silks that shimmered like moonlight, moved through the dance with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Henry, his golden beard catching the light, watched her with eyes that burned. He was a king accustomed to having his desires fulfilled. Yet Anne was no ordinary prize. She was a riddle, a challenge, a woman who would not bend. Their first encounters were subtle, a game of glances and guarded words. Henry, married to Catherine and bound by the chains of duty, found himself ensnared by Anne's allure. She was not like the others, not like her sister Mary, who had briefly been his mistress, nor like the countless ladies who offered their hearts for a moment of royal favor. Anne was different. She refused to be a conquest, a fleeting dalliance to sate a king's whim. With a courage that bordered on recklessness, she demanded more, his heart,
his crown, his future. "I will not be your mistress," she is said to have declared, her voice steady as steel. "If you would have me, you must make me your queen." These words were a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a king, a challenge that would set England ablaze. Henry, consumed by his passion, saw in Anne not just a woman, but a vision of a new dynasty. Her refusal to yield only deepened his obsession, her wit and defiance a mirror to his own restless spirit. Letters flowed from his quill, each one a testament to his ardor, penned in the quiet of his chambers and sent to the woman who held his heart captive. "My heart is yours," he wrote, "and I am your servant." For Anne, these were not just words of love, but a ladder to the throne. Yet the path to queenship was fraught with peril. Catherine of Aragon, beloved by the people and steadfast in her faith, would not be easily cast aside. The Church of Rome, with its iron grip on marriage and morality, stood as a formidable barrier. But Anne was no mere dreamer. She was a strategist, her mind as sharp as the blades that would one day claim her. She whispered of reform, of a church free from Rome's dominion, of a king who could wield both sword and scepter without kneeling to a foreign pope. Her words found fertile ground in Henry's heart, planting the seeds of a revolution that would cinder England from the Catholic Church. As the 1520s drew to a close, Anne stood at the precipice of greatness. She was no longer the girl who had left Hever Castle, nor the maid who had danced in the courts of France. She was a woman poised to rewrite history, her ambition a flame that burned brighter than the torches of Greenwich. But ambition is a double-edged sword, and Anne's ascent would come at a cost. The court, with its whispers and watchful eyes, was already stirring. Enemies were gathering, their jealousy a silent tide that would one day rise against her. For now, though, Anne Boleyn stood tall, her gaze fixed on a crown that seemed within reach, unaware of the shadows that would soon engulf her. Thus began the epic of Anne Boleyn, a tale of a woman who dared to seize the stars, only to find that even the brightest flames can be snuffed out by the winds of fate. Her journey had just begun, and the world would never be the same.
Chapter 2: The Fire of Love and Ambition. In the gilded halls of Greenwich Palace, where torchlight danced upon tapestries and the air thrummed with the pulse of a kingdom, a storm was brewing. Anne Boleyn, with her raven hair and eyes that gleamed like polished onyx, had become more than a lady of the court. She was the ember that threatened to set England ablaze. By 1526, the heart of Henry VIII, King of England, bet not for his queen, Catherine of Aragon, but for the woman who refused to be his mistress. Anne, with a boldness that shook the very foundations of the Tudor court, had ignited a passion that would reshape a nation. This was no mere love story. It was a clash of wills, a dance of power, and a prelude to revolution. Henry VIII, a titan clad in velvet and gold, was a king whose desires were law. His reign, once a beacon of chivalry and splendor, was now shadowed by a singular obsession: a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Catherine, his queen of nearly 2 decades, had borne him only a daughter, Mary, and a string of stillborn hopes. The king's eyes, restless and searching, found Anne Boleyn, a woman whose allure was matched only by her audacity. She was no fleeting fancy, no courtly dalliance to be cast aside. Anne, with her French elegance and unyielding spirit, demanded what no woman before her had dared: to be queen or nothing at all. Their courtship was a tempest, a collision of fire and iron. Henry, accustomed to conquest, found himself ensnared by a woman who would not yield. Anne's refusal to be his mistress was not mere coyness. It was a calculated defiance, a gambit that staked her future on the king's heart. "I will be your wife, "Or I will be nothing," she declared, her voice a blade that cut through the flattery of the court. Her words were a challenge, a spark that kindled Henry's obsession into a blaze. He pursued her with the fervor of a hunter, his letters pouring forth like a river, each one a vow of devotion. "My heart is yours alone," he wrote, his quill trembling with the weight of his longing. "You are my sun, my stars, my everything." Anne, however, was no passive muse. She was a strategist, her mind as sharp as the quills that penned her fate. Her charm was her knight, her wit her queen, and her ambition the board itself. She danced at masques, her laughter a melody that drew the king closer. She debated theology with scholars, her intellect a mirror to Henry's own restless mind. And she whispered of a future where England could break free from Rome's chains, a future where a king could rule both church and state. These were not the words of a mere lover, they were the manifesto of a revolutionary. The court watched, breathless and wary, as Anne's star rose. Catherine of Aragon, steadfast and devout, remained a formidable presence. The daughter of Spanish monarchs, she was a queen beloved by the people, her piety a shield against the whispers of annulment. Yet Henry's heart was no longer hers. The fracture in their marriage, widened by years of childless sorrow, became a chasm with Anne's arrival. The king, driven by love and dynasty, sought to cast Catherine aside, but the path was fraught with peril. The Pope, Clement VII, held the keys to marriage and divorce, and Rome's authority was a chain that bound even kings. Anne, undaunted, saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. She spoke of reform, of scholars like Luther who challenged Rome's dominion. Her library, filled with forbidden texts, became a beacon for those who dreamed of a new church. She urged Henry to seek allies among the reformers, to question the Pope's power, to envision a kingdom where the king was supreme. These were not the words of a mere lover, they were the manifesto of a revolutionary.
The years of courtship were a crucible, testing Anne's resolve and Henry's patience. The court buzzed with intrigue, a hive of whispers and schemes. Thomas Wolsey, the king's cardinal and chancellor, was tasked with securing an annulment from Rome. Wolsey, a man of towering ambition, saw Anne as a threat, a spark that could ignite his downfall. He underestimated her, believing her a fleeting fancy. But Anne was no mere flame. She was a wildfire, and her enmity toward Wolsey grew with each delay. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, citing the sanctity of Henry's marriage to Catherine, Wolsey's failure became Anne's weapon. She whispered to Henry of betrayal, of a cardinal too loyal to Rome, and the seeds of Wolsey's ruin were sown. By 1529, Wolsey's star was falling. Stripped of his titles and banished from court, he left a void that Anne's allies, her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, were eager to fill. The court, once a stage for Wolsey's grandeur, became Anne's battleground. She was no longer a lady-in-waiting, but a power in her own right. Her influence felt in every council chamber and whispered in every corridor. Yet her rise was not without cost. The people, loyal to Catherine, murmured of the king's great matter, their unease a shadow that followed Anne. To them she was the other woman, the enchantress who had bewitched their king. Anne bore their scorn with defiance, her chin high, her eyes blazing with the certainty of her destiny. In 1532, the tide turned. Henry, weary of Rome's refusals, took matters into his own hands. With Anne at his side, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, a title that shook the foundations of Christendom. The break with Rome was no mere act of defiance. It was a revolution, a severance of ties that had bound England for centuries. Anne, ever the catalyst, stood at the heart of this upheaval. Her influence was undeniable, her vision a beacon that guided Henry's hand. The annulment of his marriage to Catherine was secured not by the Pope, but by Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury,
a man sympathetic to reform and loyal to the king's will. On a winter's night in January 1533, in a secret ceremony shrouded in candlelight, Henry and Anne were wed. The court, unaware of the union, continued its dance of intrigue, but the die was cast. Anne, now pregnant, carried within her the hope of a dynasty, a son, Henry believed, who would cement his legacy. Her triumph was near, yet the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon her. The people still mourned Catherine, and the court whispered of Anne's ambition, her French ways, her refusal to bow to convention. She was a queen in all but name, her power a flame that both illuminated and scorched. In June 1533, Anne's moment arrived. Crowned Queen of England, in a ceremony of unparalleled splendor, she processed through London, her dark hair crowned with jewels, her gown a cascade of gold and crimson. The city, though divided, could not deny her radiance. She was a vision, a queen who embodied the promise of a new era. Yet beneath the pomp, danger lurked. The birth of her child, expected to be a prince, was the linchpin of her power. When in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, the court held its breath. A girl, though healthy and bright, was not the son Henry craved. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. Anne, however, was undeterred. She cradled her daughter, named for Henry's mother, and saw in her not failure, but a future queen. Elizabeth, with her mother's dark eyes and fierce spirit, was a testament to Anne's resilience. Yet the court was not so forgiving. The absence of a male heir cast a pall over Anne's queenship, a reminder of the fragility of her position. Henry's love, though fierce, was fickle, and the eyes of the court were already turning to new faces, new hopes. Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale lady-in-waiting, lingered in the wings, her demure presence a contrast to Anne's fire. As Anne stood at the pinnacle of her power, the storm clouds gathered. Her enemies, nobles, clerics, and even those who had once been allies watched and waited. The break with Rome had made her a target, her influence a lightning rod for resentment. She was the queen who had dared to challenge a kingdom, to bend a king to her will. But ambition, like fire, consumes as it creates. Anne Boleyn, now queen, stood on a precipice, her heart entwined with Henry's, her fate tied to the child she bore. The fire of her love and ambition burned bright, but in the shadows, the winds of betrayal were already stirring, ready to snuff out her flame.
Chapter 3: The Crown of Glory. In the resplendent summer of 1533, England stood at the crossroads of destiny, its heart pulsing with the rhythm of a new era. Anne Boleyn, once a mere spark in the vast tapestry of the Tudor court, had ascended to a throne forged in fire and defiance. Crowned Queen of England, she was no longer the bold maiden who had captivated a king. She was a sovereign, a beacon of reform, and the mother of a princess who would one day reshape the world. Yet, the crown that adorned her brow was heavy with expectation, its golden gleam masking the shadows that crept ever closer. This was the zenith of Anne's glory, a fleeting moment of triumph in a saga that teetered on the edge of tragedy. The coronation of Anne Boleyn was a spectacle that rivaled the heavens themselves. On June 1, 1533, London's ancient streets blazed with color as the city bore witness to a queen unlike any before. Anne, radiant in a gown of crimson and gold, her dark hair cascading beneath a jeweled crown, rode in a litter draped with white satin. The Thames glittered under the sun, its banks thronged with nobles and commoners alike, their cheers a chorus that masked their divided hearts. The people, still loyal to the ousted Catherine of Aragon, whispered of the king's concubine, yet none could deny the majesty of the woman who had bent a kingdom to her will. Trumpets heralded her approach, and the air was thick with the scent of roses strewn in her path. Anne, with her chin high and her eyes alight, was every inch a queen, her presence a challenge to those who dared to doubt her. Westminster Abbey, hallowed by centuries of kings, opened its ancient doors to crown her. The ceremony, presided over by Thomas Cranmer, the reformist Archbishop of Canterbury, was a symphony of ritual and power. As the crown settled upon her head, Anne's gaze met Henry's, their bond sealed not just by love, but by a shared vision of a new England. The king, resplendent in ermine and velvet, saw in her the promise of a dynasty, a son to carry the Tudor name. The court, glittering with nobles who had bent the knee to this seismic shift, buzzed with awe and unease. Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a mere knight, had shattered the chains of tradition, her coronation a testament to her unyielding ambition. Her queenship, however, was no mere pageant. Anne wielded her power with the precision of a master swordsman, her intelligence and charisma reshaping the court in her image. She was a patron of the arts, her chambers filled with musicians, poets, and scholars who drew inspiration from her French elegance. The court, once staid under Catherine's pious rule, now pulsed with vitality. Anne's laughter rang through Greenwich's halls, her dances a whirl of silk and grace that captivated all who watched. She introduced the fashions of France, sleek gowns, delicate hoods, and jewels that caught the candlelight, transforming the English court into a mirror of continental splendor. To see Anne was to see a queen who ruled not just by title, but by presence. But her influence stretched far beyond the superficial. Anne was a champion of the Reformation, her library a trove of reformist texts that challenged Rome's dominion. She corresponded with scholars like Erasmus and patronized preachers who dared to speak of a church free from papal chains. Her hand guided Henry's, urging him to consolidate his power as supreme head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth funneled to the crown, and reformist bishops rose to prominence under her patronage. Anne was no silent consort. She was a partner in governance, her voice heard in council chambers, and her will felt in the reshaping of a nation's soul. To her allies, she was a visionary. To her enemies, a heretic whose ambition threatened the old order. The birth of her daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, was both a triumph and a shadow. Born at Greenwich Palace, the infant was a marvel. Her dark eyes a mirror of her mother's, her cries a herald of hope. Anne, recovering from the rigors of childbirth, cradled her daughter with a fierceness that belied the court's disappointment. Henry had longed for a son, a prince to secure his line, but Elizabeth was no less a treasure to Anne. Named for the king's mother, the princess was baptized in a ceremony of gold and incense, her place in the succession affirmed by her father's will. Yet the absence of a male heir cast a pall over Anne's queenship, a silent rebuke that echoed in the court's whispers. Henry's love, though fervent, was tempered by the weight of dynasty, and Anne felt the pressure like a blade at her throat. The court, ever a crucible of intrigue, was a battleground where Anne fought to maintain her grip. Her allies, her father, now Earl of Wiltshire, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and her brother George Boleyn, formed a bulwark against the rising tide of opposition. But enemies were legion. The supporters of Catherine and her daughter, Mary, saw Anne as a usurper. Their loyalty was a smoldering ember that threatened to ignite. Thomas Cromwell, the king's cunning minister, was an uneasy ally, his loyalty to Henry tempered by his own ambitions. And in the quiet corners of the court, a new face emerged, Jane Seymour, a pale, demure lady-in-waiting whose gentleness was a stark contrast to Anne's fire. Her presence, though subtle, was a whisper of danger, a reminder that a king's heart could wander.
Anne's life as queen was a tightrope walk, her every step watched by eyes that sought her fall. The pressure to produce a male heir was relentless, a shadow that darkened even her brightest moments. In 1534, she conceived again, her heart soaring with hope. The court buzzed with anticipation,
prayers offered for a prince to cement Anne's place. But fate was cruel. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage, a silent tragedy that left Anne shaken and Henry distant. The king's disappointment was a wound, his words sharp as he spoke of God's judgment. Anne, ever resilient, masked her fear with defiance, her laughter louder, her dances fiercer, as if to drown out the whispers of doubt. Her queenship was a paradox, a blend of power and vulnerability. She was adored by those who saw in her a new England, a realm unshackled from Rome's grip. Her court was a haven for reformers, her patronage a lifeline for those who dared to dream of change. Yet she was reviled by those who clung to the old ways, her name a curse on the lips of Catherine's supporters. The people too were divided. Ballads mocked Anne Boleyn, the king's paramour, while others marveled at her courage. Anne bore it all with a steely grace, her eyes fixed on a future where her daughter would reign, where her legacy would endure. Henry's love, the cornerstone of her power, was both her shield and her chain. He showered her with gifts, jewels, manors, titles, yet his passion was volatile, a flame that could warm or burn. Their marriage, once a secret vow, was now a public spectacle, their quarrels as fierce as their reconciliations. Anne, with her quick tongue and fiery spirit, matched Henry's temper, their clashes a storm that rattled the court. Yet their bond endured, forged in the crucible of their shared ambition. Henry saw in Anne not just a wife, but a partner in his quest for immortality, a queen who could bear the son he craved. As 1535 dawned, Anne stood at the height of her glory, yet the ground beneath her, the court was a glittering stage, her presence a magnet that drew poets and princes alike. She hosted feasts where wine flowed like rivers, her masks a whirl of myth and music that rivaled the courts of Europe. She was a queen of paradoxes, bold yet brittle, adored yet assailed, powerful yet precarious. Her influence on England was profound, her hand guiding a nation through the tempest of Reformation. Yet the weight of her failure to bear a son she carried was a constant, a shadow that grew with each passing month. The court, sensing her vulnerability, began to shift. Cromwell, ever the opportunist, began to distance himself, his eyes on new alliances. The Seymours, Jane's family, rose in prominence, their quiet piety a contrast to Anne's boldness. And Henry, though still bound to Anne, began to look elsewhere, his gaze lingering on Jane's serene face. Anne, with her sharp instincts, saw the danger, but refused to falter. She conceived again, her hope of fragile flame against the encroaching darkness. The court held its breath, prayers rising for a prince to silence her critics. But fate, that merciless weaver, had other plans. In January 1536, Anne suffered another miscarriage, this time a boy, a loss that shattered her spirit and widened the chasm between her and Henry. The king's grief was tinged with anger, his words a lash. "I see God will not give me male children." Anne, reeling, saw the court's eyes turn cold, their whispers a chorus of her doom. Her enemies, sensing blood, closed in, their schemes a web that tightened around her. Cromwell, once her ally, now saw her as a liability. His loyalty to Henry was a blade that could cut both ways. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, stood at the zenith of her power, yet the crown was slipping from her grasp. Her glory, so hard won, was a flame that flickered in the winds of betrayal. The court, once her stage, was now a battlefield, its shadows hiding daggers poised to strike. Her love for Henry, her ambition for Elizabeth, her vision for England, all hung by a thread. The fire of her queenship burned bright, but in the distance the scaffold loomed, its grim promise a whisper that grew louder with each passing day.
Chapter 4.
Shadows of Envy and Betrayal. In the waning light of 1535, the court of Henry VIII was a cauldron of splendor and deceit, its gilded halls masking a tide of treachery that swelled beneath the surface. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, stood at the heart of this tempest, her crown a beacon that drew both adoration and malice. Once the flame that had set a kingdom ablaze, she now faced a gathering storm, her glory dimmed by the weight of unfulfilled promises and the whispers of those who sought her fall. The fire of her queenship, though still fierce, flickered in the winds of envy, and the shadows of betrayal crept ever closer, their cold fingers poised to snuff out her light. Anne's reign, so radiant in its infancy, was now marred by the relentless pressure of dynasty. The birth of her daughter, Elizabeth, had been a triumph tinged with disappointment, for Henry VIII craved a son to secure the Tudor line. The miscarriages that followed, each a silent wound, had deepened the chasm between king and queen. The court, ever attuned to the king's moods, sensed the shift. Where Anne's laughter had filled Greenwich's halls, now her steps echoed with a quiet unease. Her dark eyes, once alight with defiance, now scanned the faces around her, searching for allies in a sea of veiled hostility. The queen who had dared to reshape a nation was now a target, her power a magnet for those who dreamed of her downfall. The court was a chessboard, and Anne's enemies moved their pieces with ruthless precision. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's minister, a man whose rise from blacksmith's son to master of statecraft was a testament to his cunning. Cromwell had once been an ally in Anne's ascent, his hand guiding the break with Rome that had made her queenship possible. But alliances in the Tudor court were as fleeting as morning mist, and Cromwell's loyalty was to Henry alone. Anne's influence, her bold voice in matters of church and state, had begun to chafe. Her insistence on using dissolved monastery wealth for charity clashed with Cromwell's vision of enriching the crown. The rift, subtle at first, grew into a fracture, and Cromwell's calculating mind began to weave a web to ensnare the queen. Another shadow loomed in the form of the Seymour family, whose quiet ambition belied their modest origins. Jane Seymour, a pale, unassuming lady-in-waiting, had caught Henry's eye with her serene demeanor, a stark contrast to Anne's fiery spirit. Jane's gentleness, her soft voice and downcast eyes were a balm to the king's restless heart, wearied by Anne's tempests. The Seymours, sensing opportunity, nurtured this budding affection, their whispers planting seeds of doubt in Henry's mind. Jane was no mere pawn, she was a weapon, wielded by a family eager to supplant the Boleyns. Anne, with her keen instincts, saw the danger in Jane's quiet presence, but her attempts to counter it only deepened the court's divisions. The supporters of Catherine of Aragon and her daughter, Mary, formed another faction, their resentment a smoldering ember that threatened to ignite. Catherine, though stripped of her title, remained a symbol of piety and legitimacy, her cause championed by nobles and commoners alike. Mary, declared illegitimate by Henry's new church, was a rallying point for those who viewed Anne as a usurper. Their hatred was a silent tide, their prayers for Anne's fall a chorus that echoed beyond the court's walls. Anne, once the architect of their ruin, now bore the weight of their vengeance, her every move scrutinized by eyes that longed for her disgrace. Anne's own family, once her bulwark, began to fray under the strain. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, were men of ambition whose loyalty was tempered by self-interest. Her brother, George, remained a steadfast ally, his wit and charm a mirror of her own, but even he could not shield her from the gathering storm. The Boleyns, elevated by Anne's rise, now faced the peril of her potential fall, their fortunes tied to a queen whose star was waning. The court whispered of their greed, their pride, their overreaching ambition, a narrative that Anne's enemies were all too eager to amplify. Henry's love, the cornerstone of Anne's power, was now a fragile thread. The king, once consumed by his passion for her, grew distant, his eyes wandering to Jane Seymour's tranquil face. Their marriage, once a blaze of defiance, was now a battleground of tempers and silences. Anne, with her quick tongue and unyielding spirit, clashed with Henry's volatile moods, their quarrels a storm that rattled the court. Yet she fought to reclaim his heart, her charm a weapon she wielded with desperate grace. She danced at masques, her laughter a melody that sought to drown out the whispers. She adorned herself in silks and jewels, her elegance a reminder of the woman who had once captivated a king. But Henry's heart, like the tide, was slipping away, drawn to Jane's quiet shores.
The winter of 1536 brought a glimmer of hope. Anne conceived again, her pregnancy a fragile promise of redemption. The court, sensing a chance for stability, offered cautious prayers for a prince. Anne, radiant despite her fears, clung to this hope, her hand resting on her swelling belly as she dreamed of a son who would silence her critics. Henry, too, was buoyed by the prospect, his affection briefly rekindled. For a moment, it seemed the storm might pass, that Anne's queenship might endure. But fate, that cruel weaver, had other plans. In January, news of Catherine of Aragon's death reached the court, a moment that should have strengthened Anne's position. Yet the celebration was short-lived. Days later, Anne miscarried a boy, a loss that shattered her spirit and widened the gulf between her and Henry. The miscarriage was a wound that bled into every corner of Anne's life. Henry's grief was laced with anger, his words a lash that cut deep. "I see God will not give me male children." The court, ever quick to sense weakness, turned colder, their smiles masking daggers. Anne, reeling from her loss, saw the shadows closing in. Cromwell, sensing his moment, began to tighten his web. He whispered to Henry of Anne's enemies, of her boldness that bordered on defiance, of her failure to fulfill the promise of a son. The king, his heart heavy with disappointment, listened, his love for Anne eroding under the weight of doubt. The spring of 1536 was a season of dread. Anne, though still queen, was isolated, her allies dwindling as her enemies grew bolder. Cromwell, now her chief adversary, orchestrated a campaign of whispers, planting seeds of scandal that took root in the fertile soil of the court's envy. Rumors of Anne's infidelity, unthinkable yet insidious, began to circulate. Her laughter, once a melody, was now twisted into evidence of flirtation. Her boldness, once admired, was branded as wantonness. The court, eager for a new narrative, lapped up these tales, their whispers a chorus that drowned out Anne's protests. Jane Seymour, ever the silent threat, grew bolder under her family's guidance. Henry's visits to her chambers became more frequent, his gifts a public declaration of his shifting affections. Anne, with her pride and her pain, could only watch as the man she loved slipped further from her grasp. Her attempts to confront Jane, to reclaim Henry's heart, were met with cold indifference, the king's temper a wall she could not breach. The court, sensing the tide turning, began to court the Seymours, their allegiance as fickle as the winds. Anne's isolation was compounded by the court's shifting loyalties. Her brother, George, remained her confidant, but his own enemies, nobles jealous of his rise, began to circle. Her father and uncle, once her champions, grew distant, their ambition tempered by fear of her fall. Even her ladies-in-waiting, once loyal, now whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting to Jane's serene figure. Anne, with her sharp instincts, saw the betrayal taking shape, but her power to counter it was waning. The queen who had once commanded the court was now a prisoner of its intrigues, every word twisted, every gesture scrutinized. Cromwell's machinations reached their climax in April 1536.
With Henry's tacit approval, he launched an investigation into Anne's conduct, a probe designed to destroy her. Musicians, courtiers, and even her closest allies were questioned, their words coerced into a narrative of betrayal. Mark Smeaton, a young musician, crumbled under pressure, confessing to an imagined affair with the Queen. Others followed, their accusations a tapestry of lies woven to condemn her. Anne, unaware of the full extent of the plot, sensed the danger but could not escape it. The court, once her stage, was now a trap, its shadows hiding the daggers poised to strike. As May dawned, Anne stood on the precipice of ruin. Her enemies, united by envy and ambition, had crafted a noose from whispers and lies. Cromwell, with his cold precision, had turned the king's doubts into a weapon, his loyalty to Henry a shield for his treachery. Jane Seymour, with her quiet allure, had become the promise of a new dawn, a queen untainted by Anne's fire. The court, ever hungry for drama, awaited the queen's fall, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had dared to seize a crown, now faced a storm she could not outrun, her queenship a flame that flickered in the gathering darkness.
Chapter 5. The Scaffold's Shadow. In the spring of 1536, the air of England was thick with the scent of betrayal, a venom that seeped through the gilded halls of Greenwich and coiled around the heart of a queen. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant flame that had set a kingdom ablaze, now stood ensnared in a web of lies, her crown a fragile shield against the daggers of her enemies. The court, once her stage, had become a crucible of judgment, its whispers a dirge that heralded her doom. The fire of her queenship, though still fierce, flickered in the shadow of the scaffold, where the cold steel of fate awaited. This was no mere fall. It was a tragedy woven from ambition, love, and treachery, a saga that would echo through the ages. The storm that consumed Anne broke in April 1536, its first gusts stirred by Thomas Cromwell, the king's master of shadows. Cromwell, with his cold intellect and ruthless ambition, had once been Anne's ally in the break with Rome. Now he saw her as a liability, her influence a threat to his own power. With Henry VIII's heart drifting toward Jane Seymour, Cromwell seized the moment, crafting a plot as intricate as it was insidious. He whispered to the king of scandal, of a queen whose boldness had crossed into betrayal. The charges, adultery, treason, even incest, were monstrous, designed not to prove guilt, but to destroy. Anne, unaware of the noose tightening around her, continued to navigate the court, her defiance a flame that burned against the encroaching darkness. The accusations began with Mark Smeaton, a young musician whose talent had once graced Anne's masques. Under Cromwell's pressure, perhaps torture, he confessed to an imagined affair with the Queen, his words a spark that ignited a firestorm. Others followed, coerced or cajoled. Henry Norris, a trusted courtier, William Bereton, a gentleman of the King's Chamber, and Francis Weston, a charming knight. Most shocking of all was the charge against George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, accused of incest, a sin so vile it stained the very soul of the court. The allegations were a tapestry of lies, woven from half-truths and twisted words, yet they carried the weight of truth in a court eager for Anne's blood. On May 2, 1536, the trap snapped shut. Anne, summoned to the king's presence, found not her husband, but a council of grim-faced nobles. The air was heavy with accusation, the room a cage of stone and silence. She was arrested, her title of queen a hollow echo as she was escorted to the Tower of London, the fortress that had seen kings crowned and traitors fall. The journey by barge along the Thames was a procession of shame, the river's dark waters reflecting the weight of her fate. Anne, her head high despite the tremor in her heart, faced the tower's ancient walls, their gray stones a monument for her impending doom. Within the tower, Anne was confined to the Queen's lodgings, a cruel irony for a woman who had once walked these halls as a bride. The chambers, though luxurious, were a prison, their tapestries mocking her with memories of triumph. Her ladies, some loyal, some spies, watched her every move, their whispers a constant reminder of her isolation. Anne's spirit, though battered, refused to break. She laughed, she wept, she prayed, her voice a melody of defiance and despair. "I am innocent," she declared to her jailers, her words a plea to a God who seemed to have turned his face from her. Yet the court, the king, and the world beyond cared little for her truth. The trial, held on May 15 in the Great Hall of the Tower, was a spectacle of injustice, a stage where truth was but a prop. Presided over by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, the court was packed with nobles whose loyalty lay with Henry and Cromwell. The charges were read aloud: adultery with 5 men, plotting the king's death, and incest with her brother, each accusation a lash that stripped away her dignity. The evidence was flimsy, a patchwork of coerced confessions and misinterpreted jests. Smeaton's broken words were the cornerstone, his confession a lie born of fear. Anne, standing before her judges, was a queen in name only, her fate sealed before the trial began. Her defense was a marvel of courage, her voice steady as she refuted each charge. "I am the king's true wife," she declared, her dark eyes blazing with the fire that had once captivated a kingdom. She denied the affairs, the treason, the unthinkable sin with her brother. Her wit, once her weapon, now served as her shield, her answers sharp and precise. Yet the court was deaf to her pleas, their verdict a foregone conclusion. The jury, swayed by Cromwell's machinations and the king's silent will, pronounced her guilty. The sentence was death, a word that hung in the air like a thunderclap, its echo drowning out all hope.
George Boleyn, tried alongside her, faced the same fate. His trial, a mirror of Anne's, was equally unjust. His charm and loyalty to his sister twisted into evidence of crime. The siblings, once the pride of their family, were now its shame, their bond a casualty of Cromwell's ambition. Anne, hearing of her brother's condemnation, wept not for herself but for him, her heart breaking under the weight of their shared ruin. The Boleyn name, once a rising star, was now a curse, its light extinguished in the tower's shadow. Henry, the king who had once penned love letters to Anne, was now her executioner. His heart, turned cold by disappointment in Cromwell's whispers, sought solace in Jane Seymour, whose quiet presence promised a new beginning. The annulment of his marriage to Anne, declared days before her trial, was a final betrayal, stripping her of her title and rendering their daughter, Elizabeth, illegitimate. Anne, once the queen who had reshaped a kingdom, was now a ghost, her name erased from the court's memory even before her death. The days leading to her execution were a crucible of faith and fear. Anne, confined to the tower, turned to prayer, her piety a refuge from the storm. She spoke of her innocence, of her love for Henry, of her hope for Elizabeth's future. Her ladies recorded her words, their pens trembling with the weight of her tragedy. "I am clean from the crimes laid against me," she said, her voice a whisper that carried the strength of truth. She prepared for death with a queen's dignity, her thoughts on her daughter, whose destiny she could no longer shape. The execution was set for May 19, 1536, a date that loomed like a specter. Henry, in a gesture of twisted mercy, spared Anne the axe, importing a swordsman from Calais to ensure a swift end. The choice of a sword, rare and precise, was a nod to Anne's French elegance, a final irony in a life defined by contrasts. As the day approached, Anne's courage shone brighter, her spirit unbowed even as the scaffold's shadow loomed. She spent her final hours in prayer, her laughter mingling with tears, her heart a battleground of resignation and defiance. On the morning of her execution, the tower was silent, its stones bearing witness to a queen's final act. Anne, dressed in a simple gown of gray damask, her dark hair bound beneath a coif, walked to the scaffold with a grace that belied her fate. The crowd, gathered on Tower Green, was a sea of faces, some mournful, some eager, all transfixed by the woman who had once held a king's heart. She climbed the steps, her steps steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeking a world beyond the one that had betrayed her. Her final speech was a masterpiece of poise, a testament to her unyielding spirit. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear as a bell, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die." She spoke of her loyalty to Henry, her prayers for his reign, her words a shield against the lies that condemned her. She did not confess to the crimes, yet she sought forgiveness, her humility a contrast to the pride that had defined her. "If any person will meddle with my cause," she concluded, "I require them to judge the best." With that, she knelt, her neck bared to the swordsman's blade. The sword fell with a single, merciless stroke, its flash a moment that severed Anne Boleyn from the world. The crowd gasped, the air thick with the weight of her loss. Her body, wrapped in a simple cloth, was laid in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her name consigned to silence. The court, already turning to Jane Seymour, moved on, but the echo of Anne's fall lingered, a wound in the heart of England. Anne Boleyn's death was more than the end of a queen. It was the climax of a tragedy that had begun with love and ambition. She had dared to seize a crown, to challenge a church, to reshape a kingdom, and for that she paid the ultimate price. The scaffold, her final stage, bore witness to her courage, her dignity, her unyielding spirit. As the tower's bells tolled, England turned its eyes away from the woman who had dared to dream beyond her station. Yet her story did not end there. In the silence of her grave, Anne's legacy endured, a spark that would one day blaze through her daughter Elizabeth into a golden age. The scaffold's shadow had claimed her life, but it could not extinguish her light, a flame that would burn eternal in the annals of history.
Chapter 6. The Eternal Flame. In the wake of May 19, 1536, the Tower of London stood silent, its ancient stones bearing witness to the fall of Anne Boleyn, a queen whose fire had scorched the heart of a kingdom. Her blood, spilled upon the scaffold, was a crimson seal on a saga of ambition, love, and betrayal, a tragedy that shook England to its core. Yet as the court turned its gaze to Jane Seymour, the new queen who stepped into Anne's shadow, the echoes of Anne's life refused to fade. Her story, far from ending in the cold earth of St. Peter ad Vincula, became a flame that burned through time, its light carried by her daughter, Elizabeth, and etched into the soul of a nation. This was no mere epilogue. It was the birth of a legacy, an eternal fire that would illuminate history for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution was a maelstrom of silence and celebration. Henry VIII, his heart already entwined with Jane Seymour, married her within days, a union that sought to erase Anne's memory from the court's gilded halls. The king, cloaked in the splendor of his new bride, declared Anne's name anathema, her image banished from portraits, her letters consigned to the flames. The Boleyn family, once a rising star, crumbled under the weight of disgrace. Thomas Boleyn, stripped of favor, retreated to Hever Castle, his ambition a bitter ash. The Duke of Norfolk, ever the survivor, distanced himself from his niece's ruin, while George Boleyn's blood stained the same scaffold as Anne's, his loyalty to her a fatal bond. The court,
ever fickle, turned its back on the woman who had once been its brightest star, her name a whisper spoken only in shadows. Yet Anne's erasure was incomplete, for her legacy lived in the tiny form of Elizabeth, the red-haired princess who bore her mother's eyes and spirit. Declared illegitimate by Henry's annulment, Elizabeth was a child of paradox, born of a queen yet cast into obscurity. Raised in the shadow of her mother's fall, she was nurtured by governesses and tutors, her mind sharpened by the same wit that had defined Anne. The court might have forgotten her mother, but Elizabeth carried Anne's fire within her, a latent spark that awaited its moment to blaze. Anne, in her final days, had dreamed of her daughter's future, her prayers a shield against the world's cruelty. That dream, though buried with her, was a seed planted in England's heart, destined to bloom. Anne's influence stretched beyond her daughter, weaving itself into the fabric of England's transformation. The break with Rome, catalyzed by her ambition, had reshaped the kingdom's soul. The Church of England, with Henry as its supreme head, stood as a monument to Anne's vision, its roots fed by her patronage of reformers. Monasteries, dissolved to fund the crown, bore the mark of her hand, their wealth a legacy of her insistence on reform over charity. The scholars and preachers she had championed, men like Thomas Cranmer and Hugh Latimer, carried her torch, their voices echoing her call for a church free from Rome's chains. Anne, though branded a heretic, was a harbinger of change, her defiance a spark that ignited a reformation that would endure for centuries. The court, however, was quick to rewrite her story. To Henry's allies, Anne was the concubine, the temptress who had led a king astray. Ballads sung in taverns mocked Anne Boleyn, painting her as a sorceress whose charms had bewitched a kingdom. Yet others, in hushed tones, spoke of her as a martyr, a queen wronged by a fickle king and a ruthless court. The truth, as ever, lay in the gray spaces between. Anne was neither saint nor sinner, but a woman of unparalleled courage, whose ambition had dared to challenge the order of her world. Her enemies had sought to erase her, but their efforts only sharpened her legend, a tale that grew with each retelling. In the decades that followed, Anne's shadow loomed large. Jane Seymour, the quiet queen who replaced her, bore Henry a son, Edward, but died in childbirth, her triumph fleeting. Henry's subsequent wives, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, each walked in the shadow of the queen who had redefined the role. The court, reshaped by Anne's elegance, retained the French flair she had introduced, its masks and fashions a silent tribute to her influence. Elizabeth, growing into a woman of fierce intellect, absorbed her mother's lessons, her courtly grace and sharp mind a mirror of Anne's own. The princess, though scorned by some, carried her mother's fire, her destiny a promise that Anne's sacrifice would not be in vain. By 1558, when Elizabeth ascended the throne as Elizabeth I, Anne's legacy burst into full flame. The Virgin Queen, as she would be known, was a ruler whose reign would become England's golden age, a testament to the strength she inherited from her mother. Elizabeth's court was a stage of brilliance, its poets, explorers, and statesmen echoing the vitality Anne had brought to Henry's reign. Her defiance of Spain, her refusal to marry, her mastery of diplomacy, all bore the mark of Anne's spirit, a legacy of courage and cunning that reshaped the world. The Church of England, solidified under Elizabeth's rule, stood as a monument to Anne's vision, its independence a victory won through her sacrifice.
Anne's story, however, was not confined to the annals of history. It became a legend, a tapestry woven by poets, playwrights, and chroniclers. In the centuries that followed, she emerged as a figure of fascination, her life a canvas for both admiration and vilification. To some, she was the tragic heroine, a woman betrayed by a king's fickle heart and a court's ruthless ambition. To others, she was the ambitious schemer, her fall a just punishment for her hubris.
The truth, as always, was more complex. A woman who dared to seize a crown, to challenge a church, to love a king, and who paid the ultimate price for her audacity. In the realm of literature and art, Anne's image endured. Shakespeare, though silent on her name, wove echoes of her tragedy into his plays. The doomed queens and bold heroines a nod to her legacy. By the 19th century, historians like Agnes Strickland sought to reclaim her story, painting her as a victim of injustice rather than a villain. The 20th century brought new voices, novels, films, and series that cast Anne as both muse and martyr. Works like The Other Boleyn Girl and The Tudors reimagined her life, blending fact with fiction to capture her allure. To some, she was a feminist icon, a woman who defied the constraints of her time. To others, a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked. The debates over Anne's character raged on, a testament to her enduring enigma. Was she a manipulator who ensnared a king, or a visionary who reshaped a nation? Was her fall the result of her own flaws, or the machinations of a court that feared her power? Historians like Eric Ives and Alison Weir pored over her letters, her trial records, the fragments of her life, seeking answers. They found a woman of contradictions, bold yet vulnerable, devout yet defiant, a queen whose influence far outstripped her brief reign. Her role in the Reformation, her patronage of scholars, her shaping of Elizabeth's destiny, all spoke to a legacy that transcended her death. In the modern age, Anne's story found new life on platforms like X, where voices debated her guilt, her courage, her place in history. Some posts hailed her as a trailblazer, a woman who challenged patriarchal norms and paid the ultimate price. Others echoed the old slanders, branding her a homewrecker whose ambition led to ruin. Yet all agreed on one truth: Anne Boleyn was unforgettable, her life a flame that burned through the centuries. Her portraits, though few, captured her essence, those dark eyes, that enigmatic smile, a face that spoke of both triumph and tragedy. Anne's legacy was not just in the grand sweep of history, but in the quiet moments of her daughter's reign. Elizabeth, ruling with a brilliance that dazzled the world, carried her mother's fire in every decision, every defiance. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English literature, the forging of a Protestant identity, all bore the faint echo of Anne's courage. The queen who had died in disgrace had given birth to a queen who would define an era, a testament to the enduring power of her vision. As the centuries passed, Anne Boleyn became more than a queen. She became a symbol. She was the woman who dared, who loved, who fell, and who rose again in the stories told of her. Her grave, unmarked in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, was no end, but a beginning, a silent promise that her fire would never die. From the scaffold's shadow, she cast a light that reached across time, illuminating the path of those who dared to dream beyond their station. Anne Boleyn, the queen who shook a kingdom, was not forgotten, her eternal flame a beacon in the tapestry of history. Thank you for journeying through the epic tale of Anne Boleyn, a saga of fire and fate that echoes through time. If her story has stirred your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us in exploring more legends that shaped history. Your support keeps these tales alive. Let's light the way together.